He was just humming barely louder than a breath when they yanked him out of the row and dragged him screaming across the dirt. No warning, no questions, just boots, dust, and silence that followed like smoke. Everyone else froze, eyes down, hands trembling over the cotton. But Mabel didn't move. She looked up just once and quietly. She began to hum the same song. It was the kind of day where even the heat felt angry, the kind that sank into the skin and stayed there like punishment. Mabel's knees ached with every bend, her fingers raw and bleeding from the burrs. But she hummed low under her breath as she worked her way down the row, her voice curling around the cotton like it was something sacred. To anyone listening, it sounded like a work song, old and tired, maybe something passed down from a grandmother long gone. But to those who knew better, to the ones who had listened closely for weeks, who had memorized the rhythm of her footsteps and the strange way she drew breath before certain lines, it was something else entirely. It was a signal. 2 rows over, Zeke paused mid-pick, his head tilted just slightly. He didn't speak, hadn't in years, but his ears worked better than most. The tune Mabel hummed had changed just one note barely off, but it was enough. His hands moved faster, not from fear, but preparation. Tessie, 3 rows down and sweating through her headscarf, stiffened the moment she caught it. Her knuckles tightened around the cotton bowl in her hand. She didn't look up. She didn't dare. But she heard it clear. Elijah farther down the field kept his head low, but his jaw clenched. They all recognized it. That version of the song meant one thing tonight. They'd waited weeks for it. Some had waited years. Mabel had been teaching them in silence, in glances and drop cloth, in the careful way she lingered near certain landmarks. She had been building the escape not with blueprints or shouts, but with patience, with music. And now the time had come. Except Jeb had jumped the note. He was young, barely 17, all restless limbs and fire behind the eyes. He'd picked up the melody too quickly, sang it under his breath too often, and forgot that freedom didn't come to those who called it loudly. When they pulled him from the field, his scream pierced the afternoon like a blade. Then came the sound of fist boots, a heavy thud. After that, nothing. The field fell into a hush so deep it felt like morning. Mabel straightened up slowly, her back crackling from the effort, and wiped her brow with the edge of her sleeve. She didn't look toward the cabins where they'd taken him. She didn't need to. As the sun dragged lower in the sky, the others worked with mechanical silence, their faces blank, their hands no longer bleeding from the thorns, because none of them dared feel anything at all. That night in the abandoned shed behind the far barn, the group gathered in near darkness. No candle was lit, just the dim spill of moonlight through the broken slats in the wall. Elijah spoke first, his voice rough. "We can't go tonight." Zeke's fingers tapped once, then twice against his leg. Tessie shook her head. "They know. They'll be out there waiting." He gave it away. Then came Mabel's voice. Calm, measured, like always. "He sang too early," she said, "but the song's still true. If we wait now, we wait until we rot." They fell quiet. No more arguments. No more doubt. She had said it, and when Mabel spoke like that, like a bell tolling, slow, no one questioned. She reached into her skirt and pulled out a folded piece of linen, frayed edges, cross-stitched center. She passed it to Tessie without a word. Outside, the air held still. The cotton field stretched into the dark like a sea of ghosts, and in the quiet, someone started to hum again. Not loud, not proud, just clear. The hum spread slowly past like breath from one set of cracked lips to the next, soft enough not to reach the walls, but strong enough to fill the room. No one harmonized. No one dared. But they each held on to that melody like it was the only thing still tethering them to the world, fragile, invisible, and yet somehow more solid than anything they'd ever known. They had no weapons, no map, no second chances, just the song. And the woman who'd carried it in her chest like fire for longer than any of them had been alive. Mabel stood quietly in the center of the shed, her arms crossed over her middle. The linen square gone now tucked into Tessie's waistband, like a promise. The others circled around her waiting, not for instruction, but for permission, for reassurance that this wasn't madness, that tonight was still possible. "They'll be watching the roads," Elijah finally said, not looking at anyone in particular. "They'll post men at the tree line, maybe dogs, maybe more. Maybe "We won't go through the road," Mabel replied without hesitation. "We won't touch anything white men would expect us to run toward." Zeke nodded, tapping twice against the wall behind him, once high, once low. "That's right," she continued. "We cut west first, not north. Stay with the river until the second bend. Then split." The girl, the youngest among them, no older than 9, looked up from the corner, where she'd been quietly fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "Will you come too?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered. Mabel didn't answer right away. She turned her head toward the gap in the wall, where moonlight spilled in like water. The night air had changed, cooled slightly but tense like the wind itself had paused to listen. She didn't lie. "I'll be with you," she said simply, and that was enough. Each person carried a piece of the plan, now stitched into their memory through gesture, rhythm, and breath. Elijah had memorized the landmarks, crooked fence posts, fallen trees, the hollow log that marked the place where the group would divide. Zeke knew the alternate trail should they be discovered. Tessie held the song itself, every beaten pause etched into her hands from hours of work beside Mabel. And the girl, she didn't need anything but courage, that Mabel had seen in her eyes from the very beginning. They would leave in pairs, staggered, no more than 2 at a time. No lanterns, no shoes. The river would disguise their scent, the canebrake would hide their footprints, and the song, if sung right, would lead them back to each other if they were separated. But even with all of that, they knew the odds. Slavery didn't end with escape, it just changed shape. It followed, it hunted, and it always, always punished those who dared to challenge its grip. That truth sat heavy in the room. No one spoke it aloud, but they each carried it the way a soldier carries the weight of his own name. Not with fear, but with gravity. Mabel waited until the silence settled thick, then pulled from her apron a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She opened it carefully, revealing 7 small items. Tokens. Nothing of value to a white man, but priceless now. A button carved from bone, a matchstick with red thread tied near the tip, a bit of corn husk folded into the shape of a bird. Each one meant something. Turn left, wait for the second whistle, hide until sunrise. She handed them out without a word. Elijah tucked his into his waistband. Zeke slipped his into his palm and closed his fist around it like a vow. The girl held hers against her chest. Then at last Mabel spoke. "When you hear the dogs, don't run unless you have to. Don't scream. Don't scatter." Her voice was firm but not harsh. "They want you afraid. Don't give them that." The group nodded, slow, solemn. No one asked what would happen if the plan failed. That answer was already clear. They had all seen it earlier that day when Jeb's scream was silenced before his name even reached the sky. Mabel pressed her hand to the doorframe, her fingers trailing over a deep notch in the wood, one she'd carved herself years ago on a day she swore would not be her last. And then without ceremony, she opened the door. The night was waiting, so was freedom. And somewhere beyond the trees, the song still lingered. They moved like shadows, soft-footed and silent, slipping through the narrow cracks of night. There was no farewell, no whispered good lucks, just the quiet discipline of those who knew that one wrong breath might shatter everything. Mabel had opened the door, and now the path had opened with it. One by one, in staggered pairs, they left behind the shed, the fields, the cabins that had held their silence for far too long. Zeke and the little girl went first, their bare feet brushing against pine needles and dry grass. He led with the quiet confidence of someone who saw in silence what others only noticed in noise. The girl never let go of his sleeve, her small fingers curled tightly in the fabric, like she knew the wind might try to take her if she let go. Their path curved westward, just as Mabel had said, veering away from the obvious trails and slipping along the edges of the cane thicket that grew by the riverbank. The water glinted silver in the moonlight, soft and slow, and each ripple felt like a heartbeat they didn't dare acknowledge. Behind them, Tessie and Elijah waited longer than planned. They stayed hidden beneath a collapsed fence post near the field's edge, listening. There was no barking yet, no sound of horses, but Elijah felt the tension humming through the air like static before a storm. He touched the bone button in his pocket, his signal to break from Tessie at the second cypress tree near the river. They weren't supposed to run together beyond that point. They both knew it, but when he looked at her, the thought of splitting up felt like cutting something too deeply bound. "You ready?" he whispered. Tessie nodded, jaw set. Her hands trembled slightly, but she said nothing. They rose and moved together, ducking beneath branches and crawling through gullies carved by years of floodwater. Every now and then, Elijah would stop and press his hand to the ground, feeling for vibration. Not once had Mabel relied solely on her ears. She taught them that the earth speaks louder if you're patient enough to listen. By the time they reached the canebrake, the sky had begun to shift, still night, but with the faintest tinge of gray near the horizon. Dawn was coming faster than expected. They hadn't yet crossed the first river bend. Then came the sound. Not barking, not horses, a snap. Sharp, deliberate, like someone breaking a branch on purpose. Elijah threw an arm out in front of Tessie and dropped low. They listened. Another crack closer this time and heavier. Someone was tracking them. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her deeper into the thicket away from the worn deer trail they'd been following. The underbrush tore at their legs, but they didn't stop. Behind them, the sound grew louder, footsteps now and voices. Male, white, armed. Tessie tripped once but didn't fall. Elijah didn't speak, there was no time. He scanned the trees ahead, searching for the landmark, the bent pine leaning over the creek bed. If they could reach that, they could split just as Mabel instructed. They would double back in opposite loops, confuse the trail. But when they reached it, the pine was gone. A fresh stump remained raw and weeping sap. Elijah cursed under his breath. The path had changed. Had someone else used it? Had someone been caught? He looked at Tessie. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. But her eyes were clear, waiting, ready. We go off script, he murmured. She nodded once, then took the lead. They veered hard left deeper into the trees, away from the map burned into their memory. Behind them, the voices didn't fade. Whoever was chasing them wasn't guessing they were tracking. Meanwhile, far behind them, Mabel walked the perimeter of the outer cotton fields with a calm that felt almost unnatural. She was alone now. Her path hadn't been carved into any plan. It was hers alone to make. She carried no token, no map, no pair to hold pace with. Just the memory of each facer she'd let slip into the trees and the knowledge that every second she bought was a step further from capture for someone she loved. As she passed the fence post that marked the outer trail, her eyes narrowed. The branch, the one placed there as a marker to indicate safety, was missing. She bent low, brushed her fingers through the dirt, and found what she feared. Boot prints, fresh, deep. She stood slowly. The stillness around her wasn't natural anymore. Something had shifted. They were being hunted. Maybe all of them. But she didn't panic. She adjusted the cloth wrapped around her waist, reached into her apron, and pulled out a small pouch of lard. Moving deliberately, she smeared it across her skirt and along a nearby log, just enough to confuse the dogs. Then with the faintest tremble in her voice, she began to hum again. Not the signal this time. Not the song of departure. This one was meant to be heard and followed. The melody came low, like a thread of smoke unraveling in the dark, barely louder than the wind that rustled through the cotton stalks. Mabel walked as she hummed, tracing the same route the overseers would expect a desperate slave to take, broad, exposed, the kind that led straight toward the edge of the property and certain capture. But this time she wasn't avoiding detection. She was inviting it. Each note she let loose into the air carried weight not in volume, but in meaning. She wasn't singing for the trees or for comfort, not to herself or even to the night. She was singing for them, for the men with dogs and guns who thought they understood power because they had the tools to take life. She was drawing them in step by step like a fisherman leading prey to the hook. Behind her, the faintest signs of pursuit began to emerge, an echo of boots, the faint jingle of metal, a low whistle, brief and sharp. Mabel didn't glance back. She kept her pace steady, her tune unwavering. Every sound she made now was calculated, the scrape of her foot over dry leaves, the way her hand brushed against a branch so it would snap just loud enough to be noticed. She moved like someone who had spent a lifetime being unseen and had for the first time chosen to be visible. Half a mile ahead, Tessie and Elijah were crouched in a ditch where the earth dipped into a narrow stream bed. Their path had gone from uncertain to unknown, and every minute they stayed put increased the chance of discovery. Elijah's breathing was ragged sweat streaking down his face in dark lines, his hands still gripping a stone he'd picked up the moment they went off course. Tessie was bleeding again. The wound on her leg had reopened, but she didn't mention it. She hadn't spoken in several minutes. Then, like a thread tugged loose from a tapestry, they heard it. A voice, far away, a tune rising up through the trees, winding over water, pulled along by the wind. Tessie turned first, Her body stilled. She knew that melody, not the message inside it, but the person behind it. "It's her," she breathed. Elijah didn't respond right away. His instincts screamed to run in the opposite direction, to put as much distance between them and the sound as possible. But something in her tone made him stop. He glanced toward the trees behind them, then back toward the path they'd just come from. Mabel's song drifted closer. "She's drawing them," Tessie said, as if explaining something sacred. "She's taking the road we were meant to." There was a pause as that settled between them. Elijah's grip on the stone loosened. "She'll lead them east," he whispered, realization blooming in his voice like sudden light. Away from the river? It wasn't part of the plan. Not exactly. But the logic was undeniable. If Mabel made herself the target, if she could make them believe she was the key, the core of it all, then maybe the rest of them could slip through unnoticed. He touched the mark on the tree beside him, an old scar in the bark where someone had once carved the letter L. It wasn't part of their coded trail, but it pointed west. He took it as a sign. "Come on," he said, reaching down to help Tessie stand. She winced, but let him pull her to her feet. They turned and began to move again, this time angling further into the woods toward a route not mapped or rehearsed, but offered, given by a woman who hadn't needed permission to change the plan. Back near the field's edge, Mabel slowed her steps. The song in her throat shifted, same tune, new tempo like a river bending at a fork. She knew they were closing in now. She could feel it in the weight of the night, in the way the birds had gone still, in the crack of a twig not broken by her. A shadow moved along the tree line behind her. Then another. She pressed her palm against a nearby pine, steadying herself. Her joints ached. Her breath was shallow, but her spine remained straight. Let them come. Every second they spent chasing her was another second her children, because that was what they were now, had to run farther, to disappear better, to live longer. She thought briefly of Jeb, of the way his scream had vanished into the soil. She would not let that be the last sound the land remembered. So she sang louder. And as the dogs began to bark, as the footsteps thundered toward her, Mabel stepped into the open. Her voice did not tremble. She was no longer hiding. She was the distraction. She was the door. The moment her foot crossed into the open field, the world seemed to hold its breath. The cotton swayed faintly under the weight of the night wind, brushing against her skirt like it remembered her hands. Mabel's voice filled the clearing, not as a cry for mercy nor as a final hymn, but as something older, something that had outlived whips and chains and men who believed they could silence it. The dogs barked louder now, confused by the scent trail she had laid, and the calm, upright figure that stood where prey was never meant to wait. She did not run. She did not hide. Instead, she began to walk. Each step carried the rhythm of memory, of years bent beneath the sun, of fingers bloodied on burrs of children taken and names forgotten. Her song cut through the night, not sharp, but steady. A guidepost, a boundary, a line drawn in the dirt between what they had always known and what she refused to carry any further. Behind her, boots pounded against dry soil. Voices called out. Orders barked. But she did not turn to meet them. Somewhere in the dark, not far off the path she had abandoned hours before, Elijah paused mid-step. Tessie leaned against him, breathing hard, her leg nearly giving out beneath her. They had run longer than planned, dodging the patrol that had circled back after losing Mabel's scent trail at the edge of the cane thicket. For a moment, Elijah thought they were too late, that the trick hadn't worked, that she hadn't bought them enough time. But then, clear and distinct, he heard it. The song. It was faint, stretched thin by distance, but it was unmistakable. The pitch of it, the cadence, the way it lingered at the end of each line, like it was holding something in its hands. Tessie heard it too. Her hand tightened on Elijah's arm. "She's still going," she whispered, disbelief and awe braided together in her voice. He nodded, heart heavy in his chest. "She's giving us every second she can." They didn't wait. They turned again, weaving their way through the underbrush toward the dry creek bed that would take them to the river's edge. From there, if luck stayed with them, it was only another mile to the hidden canoe Mabel had buried weeks before. She had shown them the spot in passing, like it wasn't important, like it wasn't going to matter. But Elijah remembered. She had always known it might come to this. Meanwhile, Mabel reached the center of the field. The light from the torches began to glow around her, flickering against her skin, casting long, warped shadows that made her seem both larger and smaller than she really was. The first of the riders pulled up, slowing his horse at the sight of her. Confusion crept into his face. He had expected fear, panic, the wild eyes of a woman caught in the middle of a desperate escape. But Mabel just stood there, the corners of her mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You came a long way," she said, her voice calm. The man raised his rifle, hesitated. "Where are the others?" he barked. She didn't answer. Another man approached on foot, the one with the tracking dogs. He was sweating under his hat, lips curled into a snarl. "She's alone," he spat. "It's a bluff." Mabel tilted her head. "Is it?" They didn't know what to do with her, not yet. She wasn't running and she wasn't resisting. She just was. Rooted to the spot like the old oaks at the edge of the plantation, unmoved by time or weather or rage. Behind them a dog whimpered, tugging its handler toward the left. The man swore under his breath. The scent trail split again. And for a brief second, just long enough to matter, they all looked the wrong way. Mabel took a step back. The gun cocked. "Don't," one man said to the other, uncertain now. "We might need her." But it didn't matter anymore. Not to her. Because somewhere out there, feet were moving through water. A girl was clutching a carved bird in her fist. Zeke was counting steps with his fingers. And Elijah, tired and battered and still breathing, was guiding them toward the bend in the river, toward the place she had shown them once long ago, without ever calling it salvation. She'd given them the path. Now she was giving them the time. She closed her eyes and waited for the price. Of all the sounds that followed her into the cotton field that night, the barking, the shouted threats, the heavy footfalls against dry earth, the silence just before the first shot was the one that lingered longest. It was brief, almost unnoticeable, like the breath the earth holds right before it mourns. Mabel stood in that stillness, her eyes closed, her chest rising slowly. And in that final moment, she did not hum. She did not run. She simply breathed. The gunshot cracked through the night like the sky had split open. Somewhere deep in the woods, Elijah stopped mid-step. The sound echoed through the canopy, ricocheted off bark and stone and bone. He turned his head just slightly, not enough to lose the trail, but enough to feel it like something inside him had been carved out clean and left to bleed. Tessie gripped his hand harder. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The meaning of that sound was clear. Mabel was gone, but the path beneath their feet still stretched forward, carved by her sacrifice, lit not by lantern, but by memory and grit. They couldn't let it end here, not after everything she'd done to keep them moving. "Almost there," Elijah said, voice hoarse. "Just past the bend." They pushed forward, crossing the last of the marsh flats where reeds scraped at their skin and mud swallowed their ankles. The river glistened ahead, wide and sluggish, framed by the silhouettes of cypress trees, reaching like old hands into the water. Nestled in a shallow bank half hidden by brush and cattails was the canoe. It was exactly where Mabel said it would be. Tessie nearly collapsed beside it, tears tracking silently down her face. Elijah helped her in, then grabbed the paddle stashed beneath the tarp. The current was slow but steady, and as he pushed them off the shore, the trees swallowed them once again, carrying them further from the only world they'd ever known. Back at the field, the air hung heavy over Mabel's body. She had fallen among the cotton, her dress blooming red against the white, her arms stretched outward as if in embrace. The men stood over her, still breathing hard, their weapons lowered now. One of them lit a cigar with trembling hands. "Damned fool," he muttered. She wasn't going nowhere. But they all knew better. She had already gone further than they could follow. By morning, word spread through the quarters like wildfire. The field hands heard first, then the kitchen staff, then the stable boys. No one saw the body again. The men buried it before dawn somewhere behind the tool shed, unmarked and hurried. But the memory that couldn't be buried. The next evening, a girl no older than 10 hummed the same tune while sweeping the back porch. She didn't know all the notes. Didn't need to. The melody was enough. A whisper of defiance, a thread of truth. In the days that followed, more escaped. Not in waves, but in twos and threes, always under moonlight, always quiet. They followed signs etched into tree bark, hand-carved stones, the careful absence of branches where Mabel had once passed. And each time someone asked how they knew where to go, the answer came with a shrug Mabel showed us. Even those who had never met her learned her name. She became a story told in hush and reverence in campfires and coded songs. Not as a martyr, but as a map. As the woman who had stood tall in the field and dared death to blink first. As the one who sang not because she was free, but because she refused to let the silence win. Months later, far beyond the plantation's reach, Elijah sat on a porch in a safe town, hammering nails into new wood. A young boy beside him, curious and wide-eyed, asked, "Did you know her?" The lady from the song, Elijah, paused, the hammer halfway raised. Then slowly he nodded. "I didn't just know her," he said. "She's the reason I'm breathing." And as the sun dipped low, bathing the horizon in amber light, he began to hum, not loudly, not with words, but with purpose. Across the yard, others joined in, each note a thread in a tapestry that would never be forgotten. Mabel was gone, but her song had only just begun. The song outlived the woman who first sang it. Long after the cotton fields had grown quiet, after the overseers left the plantation behind like a graveyard too haunted to plow, her melody still traveled. It moved from lips to lips, whispered beneath the breath of children learning to walk in freedom, carried in the hands of elders who once bled into soil too dry to remember their names. And every time it was sung, whether hummed in a kitchen, echoed along a riverbank, or folded into a prayer, it carried the weight of a single night, a final stand, and a woman named Mabel who chose to be the door through which others might pass. Elijah didn't speak much of that night, not even to the children who sat wide-eyed at his feet waiting for tales of how he got away. He would smile, sometimes shake his head and say only, "It wasn't me who got us out." And when they'd ask who, he'd tap the ground with his fingers and murmur, "Someone who stayed so we could leave." But one day, as a new church was being built on the outskirts of their settlement, timbers, freshly cut benches still rough to the touch, Elijah stood before the congregation with a carved wooden plaque in hand. On it, a single name, Mabel. He placed it just beneath the small window where morning light always fell, so that at the first service every Sunday, her name would glow as if the sun itself had come to bear witness. "She gave us more than time," he said softly, his voice reaching only the first few rows. "She gave us a future." The congregation stood in silence, many with bowed heads, some with closed eyes. Then someone began to hum, a single note low and steady. Another voice joined, and then another. Soon the small wooden chapel filled with a sound that carried no lyrics and needed none. It was the sound of remembrance, of gratitude, of freedom purchased in full. Meanwhile, back in Georgia, the land where Mabel had lived and died changed hands twice. The plantation was sold off in parcels turned into farmland, then left to grow wild. Nature crept back, slowly vines overtook the slave quarters. Owls nested in the old haylofts, and the cotton fields, once so meticulously kept, bloomed wildly in patches before dying away under the weight of time. But one tree remained. It stood alone in the center of the old East Field, the same field where Mabel had made her final stand. No one remembered planting it. It hadn't been there before. But it grew tall, straight, and stubborn, with bark the color of deep iron and roots that cracked the soil like veins. Local children came to call it the singing tree because when the wind passed through its branches just right, it made a soft humming sound, strange, mournful, beautiful. A group of travelers once stopped beneath it, escaping the heat of late summer. One woman, elderly and slow to speak, touched the trunk with reverent hands and whispered, "This is where she fell, isn't it?" No one answered. They didn't need to. Far away in the northern towns where many former slaves had started new lives, the story of Mabel began to spread. Not as a myth, not as a sermon, but as a truth. Teachers told it to students. Mothers passed it to daughters. Musicians wrote it into ballads. And with each retelling, her name remained intact. Not because it was written down, but because it had been carved into memory the way only sacrifice can do. Years later, when Elijah himself had grown old and gray, he stood at the river's edge with his granddaughter. She was stubborn like Tessie, curious like Zeke, and bold in ways he didn't quite understand. She asked, "Is it true she didn't run?" Elijah smiled, slow and tired. "She didn't run," he said. "She didn't need to." The girl frowned. "But why not?" He looked out at the water, quiet for a moment. Then, with a voice softer than the wind that rippled through the trees, he said, "Because she had already crossed over long before her body fell." He looked down at the girl, and pressed a small wooden token into her hand, shaped like a door. "Keep walking," he said, "but remember who opened it." And together they walked away from the river, the song still echoing somewhere behind them, light as breath, strong as bone, eternal as justice. If this story moved you the way Mabel's song moved through the trees, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep these untold stories alive. Thank you for watching and for remembering her name.